Joining us now is Briahna Joy Gray. She is the National Press Secretary for Bernie Sanders for President. She's also an alumni of TMBS University. Bree, how you doing?
Is my certificate in the mail? Is this a for-profit institution?
Yes, all of the above. Emphasis on in the mail.
We have a plan for universities like yours.
Oh, wait a second. All right, guys. Hot, surprising announcement. Donald Trump has been steering this country in the right direction. Bree, first of all, thank you guys. I think you guys are, doing very well, and everybody should stay relentless and act like you're 20 points behind and all the rest. But clearly some things are breaking through, and things are breaking through to the point where, of course, there's a big neurotic freak out across a lot of legacy media and in sort of elite Democratic circles. And so let's just get down to it. I mean, why, in your view, and I'll say this transparently, I think you could have made a case a while ago for various reasons that I always thought it was Bernie or Biden were the most electable, frankly, as like an outside arbiter. Increasingly, it seems to me, Bernie is like the only one to responsibly put up against Donald Trump. But regardless of that, why is all of these stories that we're seeing from the Chates and Frums of the world, why is that not conforming with reality?
Why is it that people who have always been cheerleaders for war and the corporatist candidate don't like Bernie Sanders?
Yes, Bree. I like how you took my loaded question and just like loaded it a couple more notches. Go for it.
Look, I mean, we knew this was coming, right? When Bernie Sanders started talking about how we welcome their hatred during his Democratic Socialist speech back in the summer, he was presaging what was going to come down the pike when it became finally clear to the establishment that we didn't just have a chance of winning, we had a very strong chance of winning, and that they were going to have to start to show their cards and more explicitly combat us if they didn't want us to radically change the country the way that millions of Americans who have donated to our campaign in smaller donations, volunteered on our behalf, and otherwise put their lives behind this effort, know they want to have done, right? They know that the only way to push back against the overwhelming will of the people that has been demonstrated in myriad ways through this campaign is to rig the system. And that's what we're seeing now. We saw it first in this media push. We're seeing it a little bit with what's happening with these DNC rules. And it's what is expected when you have a movement that is presents such a sea change, which with business as usual.
And with regard, and let's get to the rules in a second, but I think it's really important what you're saying. I think what these talking points and this spin is meant to do is, of course, there's a contingent of people that are elite and they hate Sanders and they hate the movement and they're militarists and all the rest for sure. And they can have their own sort of self-perpetuating narrative. I think the idea, though, is that to the extent it filters out into the actual population is just to have people feel like they know that they're wronged. They know that things are bad. But you know what? Don't hope to change. Don't actually feel comfortable to take what you perceive as a risk. And so how on an emotional level, I'm actually basically asking, do we counteract that even beyond, debunking all the kind of obvious spin here?
When I talk to folks, and this happened in an interview I did earlier today, some of the skepticism that I think exists around Bernie Sanders from people who want to support his policies, who personally support his policies and agree with what he's identified as the things that need to change in the world. The skepticism comes from this. It's thinking that, well, if the polls show that we all agree that we want things like, free public college and Medicare for all and canceling student debt, if polls show that even majorities of Republicans want all those things, why is it that we haven't had them? It must be too good to be true. It must be that the polls are wrong, because politicians would never do something that the voters that elect them didn't want, right? That's kind of, I think, in my observation, the root of some of that skepticism, the good faith skepticism. And the piece of the puzzle that's missing is the piece that identifies why it is that politicians aren't beholden to the will of majorities of people, why our democracy has been undermined. And that's because, as you well know, Michael, the role the money has been playing in politics increasingly since the 1970s, to be frank. I mean, if those of you who listen to Hear the Burn, the podcast that I host for the campaign, know that this week's episode opened with a gloss on the Powell memo, which is this 1971 memo that was a blueprint for how Republicans were going to take back the country after decade of progress, labor progress, racial progress, gender progress, LGBT progress, et cetera. And the fact of the matter is it's worked. The apotheosis of all of this in a lot of ways was Citizens United. And now we have a system where overwhelmingly politicians are more beholden to the big corporate interests that are funding their campaigns than anyone else. And Bloomberg's presence in this race, the way that he is buying a position in this without ever having to defend his views on a debate stage, now muscling himself onto a debate stage, getting the DNC to change these rules, by using his ad power to rank higher than many other front runners in this race in key delegate-rich states. It's an abomination, and I don't think that I think it's incumbent on us to make it clear to Americans why this is anti-democratic, why it's something that, regardless of their political affiliations, they should not countenance, and we've got to push back forcefully.
Bri, I want to get really specifically, because you did open it, about getting really serious about the real time. What the DNC is doing in real time with regards to Bloomberg, with regards to putting somebody like, I keep focusing on Barney Frank on the Rules Committee. This is somebody who's not only sits on a bank board and represents the Clinton wing, let's just say. He personally hates Bernie Sanders. Like, you're talking about people who not only are ideologically and in terms of, potentially even financial self-interest opposed, they have a personal fixation and dislike of him. So it's very important to have a strategy for that. But I do just want to say really quickly, and forgive my indulgence here, Bri. Earlier, you were questioning the value of your degree, and you've just said that you're hosting a successful podcast. So I think that speaks for itself.
You're presuming that I learned all of my podcasting skills
Yes.
at the Michael Brooks Show Academy of Fine Arts.
You are basically like Gallery Dell'Abate talking about the Connecticut School of Broadcasting. But all that being said, what do you think? What is because I want people to think really seriously about this. There was a lot of and look, we don't know obviously what all the scenarios are, but people need to think, in my view, in terms of like really winning this and being very aggressive out of the gate, because the barriers are being put in place and the games are being played right now, and it's quite transparent.
Yeah. Well, I think the transparency works on our behalf, right? There has been a process. I mean, there's always a process of kind of education. When we live in a society that has done so much to kind of obscure the political reality of what's going on in our system, the last 3 years since 2016 have really made it so that some of the conversations about the inequities in our political system are a lot more obvious now than they were then. And we're at a different kind of a starting point when we're talking to the public about what's going on. And what was kind of had some plausible deniability around it in 2016 is much less so now. And now we have like these exaggerated caricatures, right? So you can say what you want to say about the critiques of Hillary Clinton and her closeness to Wall Street, speeches, what have you, no interest in getting back into all of that. But when you look at a figure like Michael Bloomberg, who has $50-60 billion, and the ability to hop into a race and spend more money on ads than every other candidate in the race so far, even though we've all been campaigning for a year and he just hopped in a couple of months ago, those kind of imbalances, the way that someone's not just, through lobbying dollars influencing politics, but through your own personal pocketbook can have such a dominant role is something that I don't think very many people are going to take sitting down. And if people want to rig this race, the way, we've talked about media bias and things like that, but if people are going to want to so aggressively and explicitly rig this race, they're going to have to contend with the fact that Americans aren't going to take it. I don't think they're going to take it sitting down. And I think that you see that with this kind of anxiety about what's going to happen to Bernie voters. You know, there's a lot of hand wringing about, well, are Bernie voters going to line up behind the eventual nominee? Well, we saw in 2016 that Bernie voters lined up behind the eventual nominee twice as much as Hillary Clinton voters lined up behind Barack Obama in 2008. But what is a real thing to think about is the fact that this campaign is premised on turning out people who historically don't vote, turning out people who historically have no interest in the democratic process because they don't see themselves represented there. And you cannot reasonably expect people like that to necessarily feel similarly engaged for any candidate interchangeably. So we have this support. We have support from people who don't normally get involved. And that is part of Bernie's electability argument. And just because Bernie is going to fight hard as heck for anyone who wins this nomination, because the number one priority is beating Donald Trump, doesn't mean that people are going to necessarily, the constituents that have come out, who would only come out for Bernie, are going to heed that lesson. And that's not something that is a threat, but it's a realistic decision to make when you're thinking about who's the most electable candidate and who really is the best position to beat Trump.
That's a really important point. And I also think it's also important. Look, again, I'll keep reiterating this. The goal should absolutely win by such a margin that even these games are out of question. And I love the energy and people's forcefulness with this, because that's really what it's going to take. But the question needs to start to shift, I think. I mean, first of all, Bernie should never get the question, will you support the nominee one way or another? Because he's been very clear about that. But beyond that, other people have maybe been not clear about that. But the second question to start asking is, do you believe that the person who has the delegate lead should be the nominee? Do you believe the person who has received the most votes and has the delegate lead should be the nominee? We need to be quite clear about that.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I hope that other journalists who have not graduated from your esteemed institution take that very sage advice and start asking that question.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.